Hello, my name is Debayan Basu, and I am an assistant professor at the Department of English, Surendranath College for Women, which is affiliated to the University of Calcutta. Today, I would be discussing William Faulkner's novel, The Sound and the Fury. As you well know, William Faulkner was born in New Albany, Mississippi, but his family soon moved to Oxford, Mississippi. Almost all his novels take place in and around Oxford, which he renames as Jefferson, Mississippi. As a young boy, he had joined the Canadian and later the British Royal Air Force during the course of the First World War and studied for a while at the University of Mississippi, besides also working temporarily at a New York bookstore and a New Orleans newspaper. Except for some trips to Europe and Asia and a few brief stays in Hollywood as a scriptwriter, he worked on his novels and short stories on a farm in Oxford. He spent a little more than a year as a special student at the State University, popularly known as the Old Miss, and later worked as a postmaster at the university station until he was fired for reading on the job. In an attempt to create a saga of his own, Faulkner has invented a host of characters which is typical of the historical growth and subsequent decadence of the American South. The human drama in Faulkner's novels is then built on the model of the actual historical drama extending for almost a century and a half. Each story and each novel contributes to the construction of a whole, which is the imaginary Yoknapatawpha County and its inhabitants. As a young man, Faulkner was influenced by the work of English poets such as A.E. Housman and Algernon Charles Swinburne, and he began writing poems that explored the romantic themes of lost love and natural beauty. In all his works, Faulkner has used new techniques to express his views of man's position in the modern world. In his earlier works, Faulkner viewed man's position in the universe with despair. He saw man as a weak creature incapable of rising above his selfish needs. Later, Faulkner's views changed. In his later works, he sees man as potentially great, or as in Faulkner's own words, and I quote, "Man will not merely endure, he will prevail." End quote. In almost all his novels, Faulkner penetrates deeply into the psychological motivations for man's actions and investigates man's dilemma in the modern world. Of all his achievements, The Sound and the Fury is considered to be one of his greatest novels. Now, a study of The Sound and the Fury would not be complete without its historical context. And as we understand, The Sound and the Fury was first published in the October of 1929. It was Faulkner's fourth novel and was clearly his first work of genius. Now it is considered to be one of the strongest American contribution to the fiction of high modernism. It has generated countless critical interpretations, and during the course of the writing of the novel, Faulkner experienced a creative absorption and passion that he was never to forget. He said this of The Sound and the Fury, and I quote, "It's the book I feel tenderest towards. I couldn't leave it alone, and I could never tell it right, though I tried hard and would like to try again, though I would probably fail again." The novel tells the story from four different perspectives of the disintegration of a southern family. This is Faulkner's fourth novel and is sometimes considered to be his greatest work of fiction. Now, told from four very different and contrasting points of view, the novel concentrates on the breakdown of the Compson family over a period of 3 decades, from around 1900 to 1928. In response to questions about the novel, Faulkner explained that he started it with the image of a young girl, Caddy Compson, climbing a tree in order to look through the parlor window at her dead grandmother laid out in the house. The book had its inception, as Faulkner said, and I quote, "with the picture of the little girl's muddy drawers," end quote, and her brothers who, quote again, "didn't have the courage to climb the tree," quote close. Caddy is therefore often considered to be the central character in the novel, and the relationship that her three brothers, Quentin, Jason, and Benji, have with her is the novel's integrative theme, seen from multiple perspectives. Although Caddy's presence is pervasive throughout The Sound and the Fury, she does not actually appear in the novel. And in sharp contrast to her brothers, each of whom narrate a chapter, Caddy offers no narration of her own, leaving readers to speculate on what her rendering of events would have been. By around 1912, a year or so after Caddy had left her family and infant daughter, Dilsey's husband, Roscus, remarks that Caddy's name is not spoken in the Compson household. As you can well understand that the story or the novel in The Sound and the Fury was begun in early 1928. Initially, Faulkner had started the novel as a short story, which he had titled Twilight. But the material was too complex to be confined to that genre. Towards the end of that same year, in a letter to his great aunt, Alabama Leroy, Faulkner comments about the book he is writing. And I quote, "The damnedest book I ever read. I don't believe anyone will publish it for 10 years. Quote close. The book, however, was published a year later. Faulkner also wrote an appendix to the novel about 20 years after it was published. In a very famous interview at the University of Virginia, Faulkner explained that the appendix was another attempt at trying, what he says, and I quote, "to make that book, to match the dream," quote close. On several occasions, Faulkner referred to The Sound and the Fury as his best failure and the one that he loved the most. Because of its experimental style, The Sound and the Fury presents a daunting challenge for readers. By 1929, Faulkner had given up trying to please publishers and reviewers. As Albert J. Guerard has noted, he only seemed to write for himself and a happy few. Traditional aspects of the novel, like exposition, plot, and character development, are cast aside in the attempt to find a narrative form that could represent the realities of mental chaos, the fluidity of time and memory, and the painful interweaving of the separate selves in the family life. Though at times Faulkner's material may seem so inchoate as to be barely containable within language at all, The Sound and the Fury attains heights and depths of expression that are truly breathtaking. It is an unforgettable work that richly rewards the reader's efforts. The setting of The Sound and the Fury is in Mississippi in the early 1900s, and the story primarily follows the decline of the Compsons, a white aristocratic family. When the South was defeated in the Civil War in the 1860s, slavery was consequently abolished. But many of the wealthy families in the American South, they lost their source of income. The Sound and the Fury was written, therefore, in a postbellum American South in the period which in American history is often known as the Reconstruction. This very critical moment in American history was almost a suggestion that the South was in the process of redefining itself and its values in the absence of slavery. Certain Southern families, especially the old landed families, refused to participate in this process, and instead they turned inward and clung on to their traditions and values, to the vague notions of honor, purity, and virginity. Although Reconstruction was an effort to return the South to prosperity and establish rights for the freed slaves, it was mostly a failure. As a result, families like the Compsons lost their wealth and status while still clinging on to their old aristocratic traditions and values, even in the face of the changing modern world. At the same time, black families like the Gibsons, represented in the novel, were still considered to be second-class citizens, hardly better off than they were as slaves, and subject to the infamous Jim Crow laws, indentured servitude, and the danger of being lynched by the racist organization Ku Klux Klan. Therefore, the novel's historical and social context point it as one of the leading exponents of the discussion of the postbellum American South. Now, if we are to discuss the question of a plot in The Sound and the Fury, it would be a futile exercise, because attempting to apply traditional plot summary to The Sound and the Fury is difficult. At a basic level, the novel is about the three Compsons brothers' obsession with their sister Caddy. But this brief synopsis represents merely the surface of what the novel contains. A story which is told in 4 chapters by 4 different voices and not necessarily in a chronological order. The Sound and the Fury requires intense concentration and patience to interpret and understand. In some ways, The Sound and the Fury unfolds like a symphony. The opening section, that is the Benji section, being the opening movement which strikes the theme. Caddy, who will recur like a leitmotif throughout the following 3 sections. The second book, which is centered around Quentin, is the reflective movement, the Adagio. The third book brings in a bit of comic relief after the tension created by the first two sections and centers around the character of Jason. It might be called the Allegro. In the fourth book, we get the great finale with Dilsey, the family's Negro cook, acting as a chorus. The first three chapters of the novel, therefore, consist of convoluted thoughts, voices, and the memories of the three Compson brothers, captured on 3 different days. The brothers are Benji, a severely retarded 33-year-old man speaking in the April of 1928. Quentin, a young Harvard student speaking in June 1910. And Jason, a bitter family supply store owner, speaking again in the April of 1928. Faulkner tells the fourth chapter in his own narrative voice but focuses on Dilsey, the Compson family's devoted Negro cook who had played a great part in the raising of the children. Faulkner harnesses the brothers' memories of their sister Caddy, using a single symbolic moment to forecast the decline of the once prominent Compson family and to examine the deterioration of the Southern aristocratic class since the Civil War. The Compsons are one of the several prominent names in the town of Jefferson, Mississippi. Their ancestors helped settle the area and subsequently defended it during the Civil War. Since the war, the Compsons have gradually seen their wealth, land, and status crumble away. Mr. Compson, the head of the family, is an alcoholic. Mrs. Compson is a self-absorbed hypochondriac who depends almost entirely upon Dilsey to raise her 4 children. Quentin, the oldest child, is a sensitive bundle of neurosis. Caddy is stubborn but loving and compassionate. Jason has been difficult and mean-spirited since birth and is largely spurned by the other children. Benji is severely mentally disabled, an idiot with no understanding of the concepts of time or morality. In the absence of the self-absorbed Mrs. Compson, Caddy often serves as a mother figure and symbol of affection for Benji and Quentin. As the children grow older, however, Caddy begins to behave promiscuously, which torments Quentin and sends Benji into fits of moaning and crying. Quentin is preparing to go to Harvard, and Mr. Compson sells a large portion of the family land to provide funds for the tuition fees. Caddy subsequently loses her virginity and becomes pregnant. She is unable, or rather unwilling, to name the father of the child, though it is likely to be Dalton Amos, a boy from town. Caddy's pregnancy leaves Quentin emotionally shattered. He attempts to claim false responsibility for the pregnancy, lying to his father that he and Caddy have committed incest. Mr. Compson is indifferent to Caddy's promiscuity, dismissing Quentin's story and telling his son to leave early for the Northeast, that is, the Harvard University. Attempting to cover up her indiscretions, Caddy quickly marries Herbert Head, a banker she met in Indiana. Herbert promises Jason Compson a job in his bank. After marriage, Herbert immediately divorces Caddy and rescinds Jason's job offer when he realizes that his wife is pregnant with another man's child. Meanwhile, Quentin, who is still mired in despair over Caddy's sin, commits suicide by drowning himself in the Charles River just before the end of his first year at Harvard. The Compsons disown Caddy from the family, but take in her newborn daughter, Miss Quentin. The task of raising Miss Quentin falls squarely on Dilsey's shoulders. Mr. Compson dies of alcoholism roughly a year after Quentin's suicide. As the oldest surviving son, Jason becomes the head of the Compson household. Bitterly employed at a menial job in the local farm supply store, Jason devises an ingenious scheme to steal the money Caddy sends to support Miss Quentin's upbringing. As the course of the novel progresses, we come to know that Miss Quentin grows up to be an unhappy, rebellious, and promiscuous girl, almost a split image of her mother, who is constantly in conflict with her overbearing and vicious uncle, Jason. On Easter Sunday of 1928, Miss Quentin steals several $1,000s from Jason and runs away with a man from a traveling show. While Jason chases after Miss Quentin to no avail, Dilsey takes Benji and the rest of her family to Easter services at the local church. So the plot of the novel is pretty convoluted, and it shows that Faulkner employed a lot of modernist devices and techniques to make the narrative seem probable in the minds of the readers. A next discussion would be on the main themes in Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury. Now, since The Sound and the Fury is a modernist variation upon the family chronicle novel, its themes are consonant with that form. A unique model is the German modernist Thomas Mann's work Buddenbrooks, also named for the family that forms the subject of the novel and is significantly subtitled The Decline of a Family. The major theme of the family chronicle novels is obviously decline. The falling fortunes, economical, spiritual, even physical, of a family through a few generations from the time of a powerful and successful patriarch to the one which is at present. In some ways, Faulkner's own family was a reflection of what he described adequately in the Compson household. For example, his great-grandfather, Colonel William C. Faulkner, although was a self-made man, his grandfather, who was also eccentric but successful, whereas his own father was a self-defeated person. So in some ways, Faulkner represented the last generation or the last phase of a 4-generation family cycle which is in a state of decline. Therefore, these themes recur in Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury. They are pretty clear. They might be Quentin's frailty, impotence, and unreadiness for living, Jason's immorality, and even Caddy's promiscuity follow upon their father's economic failure and alcoholism in an American South that has changed drastically, first from the losing of the Civil War and the destruction of the economic system of the Old South, and now in the 1920s from the further impact of changes in the American economy due to the impact of the First World War. Jason, as we are told, speculates on the cotton futures market, and the family's attempt to have Quentin educated at an elite northeastern university, which is Harvard, results only in the loss of their lands, that is their pasture lands, and subsequently Quentin's suicide. The two great, human subjects which Sigmund Freud unleashed upon the modern world are the study of sexuality and death. And they play perhaps the most poignant role in Faulkner's novel, The Sound and the Fury. Since the germinal anecdote for the novel concerns a death, the child's discovery from a position of innocence, with the arrival of death in their household, it is not surprising that the pattern of the novel is punctuated with several other deaths. Quentin's suicide, his father's death, the death of Roscus are all significant transition points in the novel. But the theme is also underscored by such small details as the death of one of the family's horses, Nancy, and of the pigs that are being slaughtered for food in an early scene. And by such large details as the setting of the novel on Easter weekend and the classical, and the use of classical mythology, that is by Hades, the lord of the underworld, the abode of the dead, the power, misuse, and the misperception of sex are equally apparent as recurrent themes. Not merely Caddy's problems with her sexual coming of age in a repressive and ignorant household, but of the consequences that follow thereafter. Other important themes that relate to the problems in the Compson household have to do with religion, specifically the loss of Christian values and thus of human love and mercy, and with the philosophical conception of time. These themes are used in a manner that suggests Faulkner's awareness that they are in some respect antithetical in the modern era. The belief in divinity and in an absolute sense of time, a beginning and ending, a creation and the last judgment, as well as immorality, have endured many challenges from modern science and philosophy, as has the common sense notion of time and the idea of the uncorrupted recovery of time through memory. In the American South, thought to be a culture of noble memory and firm religious belief, the Compson family proved to be a poor example of the lost ideals. Each of the sons has a problem with religion. None of them is in fact religious, and each of them failed miserably to match up to the Christian qualities their faithful servant Dilsey espouses. And each of them, on the day Faulkner has assigned them a monologue, enact what might be said to be an ironic parody of the life of Jesus Christ on the equivalent days of his trial, crucifixion, death, and resurrection. The sons, likewise, have a problem with the concept of time. Quentin wants to stop it, but he cannot even stop its mechanical representation on the false faces of watches and clocks. And in fact, the events he wants to stop have already occurred. Benji, the idiot, cannot understand the passage of time. In his undeveloped consciousness, all events can be repeated in memory without change. Because he is a creature of pure instinct, without language, and therefore without the power of reflection and the interpretation of the past. Jason, on the other hand, wants to defeat time by creating a powerful future for himself. But he is in fact always late, regarding the sudden past with nothing but disdain. Another theme which marks its influence upon the text is the theme of race. Although it is not foregrounded in the novel, yet its presence is unmistakable in the parallel portraits of the Compson and the Gibson family members. In Quentin's reflections on race as a southerner in Massachusetts, and his dealings with the uncanny figure of Deacon at Harvard. It is also felt in the relationship between Jason and the wise old Job who works in the hardware store, and in the portraits of African American life as conducted at a remove from white observation. For example, the woman at the water hazard on the golf course and the participants in the Easter service at Dilsey's church. As the caring, sometimes outspoken but self-sacrificing servant, Dilsey in some respect resembles a far more idealized figure in the southern plantation fiction. But like the other characters in the novel, she is mostly presented through the eyes of the other. I think a question on the title of The Sound and the Fury would be very appropriate. Although it is taken down from Shakespeare's Macbeth, for all that, Benji Compson is apparently not a damaged consciousness, and although he has a damaged mind, he is unable to speak, he nevertheless does tell a tale, and his version and those of his brothers, one a walking shadow and the other a poor player who struts and frets, required a writer who had felt and mastered the contradictory emotions out of which the novel was composed. Like one of Pablo Picasso's, cubist pictures, or T.S. Eliot's multilingual poem The Wasteland, which is made up of poetic fragments, The Sound and the Fury signifies far more than its shattered form or ill-fated families literally represent. It is rich and deliberate in its use of symbolism, which Eliot would later in fact call the mythical method. Though we can say for certainty that Faulkner moved ahead of its novelist contemporaries on the race issue, many of the themes expressed in The Sound and the Fury were the common concerns of the writers in the 1920s. These are materialism and its consequences, spiritual disillusionment, the cultural impact of World War I, development of the automobile, the negative effect of small-town narrow-mindedness on the healthy development of individuals and society itself, and the impact of new ideas in psychology. Faulkner handled these themes not merely with the character and the plot, but with highly elusive substructures, which is buried beneath the everyday lives depicted in the novel, using the same mythical method that T.S. Eliot praised so much in Joyce's novel Ulysses. Faulkner's borrowings from Freud, Bergson, mythology, contemporary poetry, the history and the rituals of Christianity, and the cultural expression of his time appear to be intentional. Though the climate of ideas in this period was so rich and pervasive that they need not have been as deliberately orchestrated by Faulkner as they are, for example, in the major works of Joyce and T.S. Eliot. A question which often, in fact, is raised about the critical reception of William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury. If we look into the publication history, and if we look into the critical a kind of a critical commentary about on the novel, we must remember that The Sound and the Fury was published to a number of favorable reviews. One of the early reviewers, Lyle Saxon, in the New York Herald Tribune Books in 1929, rightly observed that Faulkner, and I quote, has achieved a novel of extraordinary effect, quote close. The narrative technique of the interior monologue prevalent throughout the novel is a clear influence of James Joyce's Ulysses. The use of this narrative device, as another critic, Michael Grodin, has pointed out, provided Faulkner with, and I quote, a solution to crucial problems in characterization that had plagued him in his first three novels. So, the interior monologue, combined as it is in the first three chapters of the novel with first-person narration, provides an intimate view of the narrator's thoughts, attitudes, feelings, and impressions, although it might also pose for readers serious interpretive challenges. The first chapter in particular may be the most problematic of all. One of the most baffling and troubling experiences many readers may have when confronting the novel for the first time is that of the narrative indeterminacy. As Cleand Brooke says, the reader's movement through the book, and I quote, is a progression from murkiness to increasing enlightenment. And this is natural, since we start with the mind of an idiot, go on next through the memories and reveries of the Hamlet-like Quentin, and finally come to the observations of the brittle, would-be rationalist Jason. Part of the sense of an enlightenment comes from the fact that we are traversing the same territory in circling movements. Quote close. So as you can understand, it received a whole lot of critical attention in the 1940s and the 1950s. Now, even after the readers progress through the novel, they may still wonder whether the first chapter could have actually been narrated by someone like Benji, by someone who lacks language. In his assessment of the issue, a very famous critic, who has discussed a lot of work by William Faulkner, Noel Polk, mentions that Benji is, and I quote, non-lingual, and in the strictest sense, not a narrator at all, quote close. Thus, the language of the first chapter then is not his, but Faulkner's. Benji's experience of the world around him is immediate. And as Polk rightfully observes, the narrative account of his awareness at any one given moment, and I quote, is almost completely visual, cinematic, and what rolls through his mind is not memory, although it is convenient to call it that. Quote close. Polk also suggests that the words throughout the chapter, that is the opening chapter, are, and I quote, Faulkner's visual representation of what Benji sees at the precise moment of seeing. Quote close. He does not actually verbalize what the golfers are going away. He just registers visually that they are doing so. By representing Benji's sense perceptions, especially the visual, Faulkner adeptly exploits the technique of the interior monologue and overcomes the difficulty of casting into the medium of language non-verbal experience. The narrative strategies that Faulkner employed in writing The Sound and the Fury can rightfully place the work within the modernist tradition. In his introduction to New Essays in The Sound and the Fury, Noel Polk again considers the novel as, and I quote, the quintessential American high modernist text. Quote close. This novel can also rightfully be ranked as Faulkner's first great literary achievement, an achievement significantly dependent on the narrative devices Faulkner employed. In another influential book written by Lawrence Thompson, who contends that The Sound and the Fury, and I quote, combines so many important Faulknerian techniques which will be found operative in different ways throughout his later novels. Quote close. That readers who have been initiated into the mysteries by the way of The Sound and the Fury should be able to avoid getting lost in some of the elaborate Faulknerian labyrinths which occur in his later novels, Absalom, Absalom, or even in The Light in August. Whether one judges The Sound and the Fury to be Faulkner's greatest novel, and quite a few do not, one cannot essentially minimize the pivotal role it plays in the development of his craft as a writer. Now, as already narrated, the novel opens as a tale literally told by an idiot, Benji Compson. The Faulkner adapted the title of the novel from Shakespeare's Macbeth, where Macbeth famously describes life as, and I quote, a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. At a meeting in Nagano, Japan, Faulkner, in response to a question regarding the addition of the definite article to the title, explained that he added it for emphasis. And as he said, quote, Sound and Fury wasn't quite enough for the ear. The ear said it needs rhythm, emphasis. Thus, The Sound and the Fury. Quote close. Though the title easily relates to Benji's section and applies specially to him, the more Faulkner worked on the novel, as he pointed out, and I quote, the more elastic the title became until it covered the whole family. Quote close. On one level, the novel concerns the collapse of the Compson family and portrays, among other things, a sense of loss, longing, discontent, and despair. With the exception of Dilsey, the Compson's black maid, who by the end of the novel appears to have achieved a profound religious insight and a spiritual freedom that transcend the delimitations circumscribing her life, each Compson brother is caught with a debilitating web of memories and unfulfilled longings. Benji is trapped within the limits of immediate impressions and associations. Quentin within an unrealized sense of sexuality and an incest complex. And Jason within a resentment and anger that dominate his thoughts and provide no relief. Caddy too is caught, but as Michael Milgate, another critic on Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, has observed, and I quote, Caddy finds an outlet from family repression in sexual activity. Quote close. And the same may be said of Caddy's daughter. The emotional power with which Faulkner casts the three brothers has a tragic counterpoint in their sister and niece. In a very famous interview with John Stein in 1956, which was originally published in the famous journal The Paris Review, Faulkner explained that The Sound and the Fury, which he said he wrote, and I quote, 5 separate times, quote close, is, and as he said again, I quote, a tragedy of 2 lost women, Caddy and her daughter, quote close. And that its beginning, the image of the muddy drawers on a girl climbing a tree had a symbolic value which he did not at first realize. This initial image was replaced by the one of the fatherless and motherless girl climbing down the rain pipe to escape from the only home she had, where she had never been offered love or affection or understanding. If we look into the last section which I would be discussing of The Sound and the Fury, I think an adequate knowledge of the novel would be incomplete without its publication history and its reception. So as we well know that it was published by this American publisher Cape and Smith in October 1929, initially it had only a printing run of something around 1700 copies. It did not sell quickly. The novel's difficult first section deterred many capable readers. This came as no surprise to Faulkner, who prior to publication had told his agent that The Sound and the Fury ought to be printed, and I quote, with different color types for the different times in Benji's section to make the text simpler, quote close. Faulkner, to his dismay, was told that this was not possible. It was, however, accomplished in 2012 when the Folio Society printed a limited edition of the multicolored version of the novel. Initial critical reactions to The Sound and the Fury were mixed. And by critical, I am not talking about academic and critical, thoughts. Many of them recognized and recommended the novel's ambition and technical complexity, but they found its material base. And as one critic put it, it is unworthy of the enormous and complex craftsmanship expended on it. For better or for worse, critics compared the novel to James Joyce's novel Ulysses, which was published in 1922, which also employed a similar style of narration that incorporated interior monologues and the stream of consciousness. Years after its publication, Faulkner expressed his dissatisfaction with The Sound and the Fury. In 1957, in that infamous interview to the graduate students at the University of Virginia, he said that it is a series of failure. That is, a novel is a series of failures. And I quote, he says, "And I tried first to tell it with one brother, and that wasn't enough. I tried with another brother, and that wasn't enough. I tried the third brother, and that failed. And I tried myself, the fourth section, to tell what happened, and I still failed." Quote close. Yet today, Faulkner's most splendid failure, as he often called it himself, is considered to be a landmark modernist text and a masterpiece of 20th century American literature. Thank you.